Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Goldster Inside Story today. I am actually going to talk to you today because I have an author who cancelled, and I decided, well, do you know what? There is an opportunity here for me to talk about my book on Lizzie Siddal. I don't know if you can see this. She was wonderful pre-Raphaelite supermodel, and she is one of the subjects of the new exhibition at the Tate, which is on the Rossettis. And Lizzie Siddal was married to Dante Rossetti, so she's in there. Her name is in there as being, one of the Rossettis. Although we best know her as Lizzie Siddal. Now, Lizzie Siddal was the pre-Raphaelite supermodel. Originally, when I wrote this book, I just called it the original supermodel. I don't know if you can see her image here. Lizzie was most famous for modeling for this painting by Millet's Ophelia. And it's just through that mostly we know her. Now, Lizzie was so much more than that. And when I was looking at this, I discovered that she was a poet. She was an artist in her own right, as well as being a muse. But those things have been largely forgotten. She's been looked at through the male gaze. And I just really, really wanted her to become part of the spotlight, her own story, not just hidden away as this woman. So I just really wanted you to be able to see Lizzie as an independent person. Now, Lizzie Siddal was born in 1829. She was born in London, and she was born in Hatton Garden, the area that's now most famous as being the diamond area of London. But when she was born, this young woman, into a very working class family, it was an area where there were lots of businesses that weren't to do with the diamond trade. Her father was a cutler. That means he literally made cutlery. But from that, he was somebody who was so important in the cutlery industry that he was trying constantly to show himself as an artiste. Now, Lizzie Siddal grew up initially around Hatton Garden, but they soon moved out to the Old Kent Road. And this is where she spent the majority of her childhood. Now, during that childhood, Lizzie had all sorts of experiences which she later embellished. And she did this, strangely enough, to make her childhood seem more impoverished than it actually was. Say her father did very well. He earned a decent amount of money. They were still very much working class, but they had aspirations to the middle classes. And when I think of Lizzie Siddal's story, it seems to be quite like Tess of the D'Urbervilles. If you know that famous book by Thomas Hardy, you'll know that Tess's family were always aspiring to be part of this grand family, the D'Urberville titled aristocratic family. And Lizzie Siddal's family were a little bit like that. So her father was one of 7 people who did have a claim to a property, which would have made them very much a kind of landed middle-class family up in Derbyshire, in the Hope Valley. This was a coaching inn that made a really decent amount of money. And through most of Lizzie Siddal's childhood, her father was fighting this court case constantly to try and show his claim. Unfortunately, the person who'd owned the property had died intestate without a will. And there were, as I say, 7 important claimants to this will. And while Lizzie Siddal's father was earning a decent amount of money, he was spending any spare money he possibly had on legal fees. It's said that one of Lizzie's sisters, when they were teenagers, picked up all of the papers and hurled them into the fire because they were so frustrated as a family. There was never any extra money to go around because her father constantly fought this court case. He said, of course, it was just as he was reaching a breakthrough in the case. Whether that's ever the case or not, who knows? It's a bit like a gambler always needing that one. This is going to be the one. This is going to be the winning ticket. Sounds to me a little bit like that story. But because of this, Lizzie and her siblings were brought up believing that one day they were going to be part of the landed middle classes, that they would have access to this coaching inn that was going to bring in a decent amount of money, and that all of them were going to be living in a world where everything was a lot easier than it was growing up in the Old Kent Road. Lizzie and her sisters all ended up in the fashion industry. So Lizzie began her career working in a hat shop. She was a milliner's assistant, and she also modelled the hats. She was very tall for a Victorian woman. She was about 5'6", and she was extremely slim. Because of this, people often claim that she was anorexic, that she had some kind of eating disorder. Actually, the more I researched this, and I spoke to quite a few eating disorder specialists, it became apparent that probably wasn't the case. She was, as we all knew, addicted to a painkiller, laudanum. Now, laudanum was a painkiller that was given as a kind of cure-all. It was taken a bit like people might take aspirin or paracetamol today. And laudanum was a tincture of opium in alcohol. So it was 90% alcohol. And it was given for many, many ailments, including things like morning sickness, which often had a disastrous result, obviously, on the pregnancy, women being given alcohol and opium. It was given to alcoholics as a cure for alcoholism, which is superb considering it was 90% alcohol. So the alcoholics were extremely happy. I don't suppose they were ever cured of anything, but they were a lot happier than they would have been had they not been given the laudanum and expected to just go cold turkey. But she grew up in this world where she and her sisters were expected to dress very elegantly, which was quite easy to do despite their lack of money, really, because they worked in the fashion industry. And they were also taught to speak with a different accent from most of her kind of working class contemporaries. And they were taught to walk well. Deportment was seen as very important because they were prepared for being part of the middle classes. So Lizzie was the third of the siblings. Their parents were called Charles Siddal and Elizabeth Evans. When she married him, of course, she became Elizabeth Siddal. She was from a Welsh family, Elizabeth, but she was living in Middlesex when she met Charles Siddal, who was, as I say, from Sheffield. So Lizzie was the third of the children born to them. Annie was born in 1825. Then there was Charles, the eldest son, born in 1828. Then Lizzie, born in 1829. Then Lydia, Mary, Clara, and James. And then the youngest child, for whom we do have a date of birth, was Henry, and he was born in 1843, by which time Lizzie was 13 or 14. Now, Henry had unspecified learning difficulties, so the family were very much responsible for his care. In the 19th century, having a child who was disabled was not something that you really received help with. If the family didn't help, nobody did. And there was not a great deal of understanding or awareness of disability. Now, of course, you would get disability allowances. That wasn't the case then. So it was a huge strain on family finances. Now, when Lizzie was growing up, she used to tell people later on that she had been carried across the street by a murderer. And this was a story that she made a huge amount of in her life. This is because in 1831, when Lizzie was just a couple of years old, the family left Hatton Garden and moved, as I said, just off the old Kent Road to a place called Kent Place in Southwark. And their landlord there was a man called James Greenacre. He was a great big man, and they were all very fond of him. He was known well locally. He was a great big, strong man, and they all thought that he'd had a difficult personal life. Now, he disappeared when Lizzie was only 7 years old, and she had very, very fond memories of him. The reason that he disappeared was because he knew he was about to be arrested. He had been in love with a woman called Hannah Brown, who was a local laundress. And she was a widow. She'd inherited a little bit of money when her husband died. And then she ran out on him. And everybody thought it was really sad. They felt that she'd led him along. And James Greenacre was terribly sad. It was an extremely, extremely cold winter. And there was a lot of snow on the ground in London. And then the following spring, when the snow started to melt, in little areas of London, pockets of London all over the place, when the snow thawed, this red liquid started to appear in the snow. And various parts of London were discovered bags in which there were dismembered body parts. Eventually, it was discovered that these were the remains of the unfortunate Hannah Brown, the fiancée of James Greenacre. She hadn't run out on him at all. It seems he had murdered and dismembered her. He was hanged in May of 1837. This caused a huge shock to the Siddals and all of those in the community who knew him as their local landlord and friend and neighbour. And Lizzie remembered that he'd been incredibly kind to her and had indeed regularly carried her and her sisters across the filthy streets. The streets were really disgusting. There were lots of butchers' shops and grocers' shops nearby. And the streets, of course, just were awash with disgusting things, as 19th century streets were before the creation of the sewers. But Lizzie would tell people this story with great glee. It's interesting how she really tried to create this very romantic working class life for herself. Actually, in terms of the kind of life they lived, their family was fairly well off and better off than many people of her acquaintance. And it seems strange, while most people in the 19th century were trying to make their lives, their backgrounds, a little more glamorous and salubrious, Lizzie seemed to have wanted it to be a little bit less respectable, as if to show how far she had come. And to me, that's very interesting, because it wasn't something that most people got away with at that time. Now, while she was working at the hat shop, she was working just off Leicester Square in a hat shop run by a woman called Mrs. Mary Tozer. And it was interesting to me when I started researching this biography to find that Mrs. Tozer had a really great opinion of Lizzie, because most of the time when you're researching Lizzie Siddal, you come across a man called William Michael Rossetti. He was one of the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, and he was the younger brother of the more famous Dante Gabriel Rossetti. William Michael, although he was part of the Brotherhood, he was not an artist, although he did try hard to be an artist. His original plan had been to be a doctor. However, when his brother refused to give up art, and Dante was the older brother, and when their father was in very poor health and the family needed supporting, William gave up his chances or his hopes of going to medical school, and he got a job, and he worked in the tax office at Somerset House. And this was to enable his older brother Dante to continue with his art and also to support the family. So William became a kind of man of letters. Although part of the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, he never became as famous as the others for his paintings and drawings, which were nothing like as good, sadly, as his friends. But what he did become known as was the chronicler of the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood and of the movement. And it's really hard to get at anything to do with Lizzie Siddal without coming across things that William Rossetti had edited, and he wasn't very fond of Lizzie. The Rossetti family seemed to resent her a great deal, and it was interesting to me because I'd always read that the Rossettis didn't like her. She was working class, she was a model, they were a middle class intellectual family. Their father had been an academic at King's College, he was a political refugee from Italy. Their mother was also the child of political refugees from Italy, and they grew up in this very world of intelligentsia and academia. And there was this upstart model who'd come into the family through having been fallen in love with by Dante when he'd been painting her. But what was interesting to me to discover was that the Siddal family were not impressed by Dante Rossetti. He might have considered himself a middle-class intellectual, but to them, he was a foreigner, and they were quite xenophobic, as the world tended to be at the time. So this was a romance that began through prejudice on both sides. But before she met Dante Rossetti, she got a job as a milliner, and it was great to see that her boss thought a huge amount of her, so that when she began her career as an artist's model, it was fascinating to me to discover that Lizzie also was kept on part-time. Now, this was not an era when you could say, do you know what, I've got another job and I want to do it because it's really exciting, but I don't really want to burn my bridges, so I'm going to stay part-time. Most people at that time would have been told where to get off. You know, you did not mess around with employment. If you had a job, you felt lucky to have it and you stuck with it. So it was great to me to get a different opinion other than that of William Rossetti, and that of a woman, and a businesswoman at that. So Lizzie was working in Mrs. Tozer's shop, and she'd been spotted by a young man who was going out with one of Lizzie's workmates. And this man was a poet. His name was William Allingham. You may recognise his name, and particularly if you know that poem about the fairies that begins, up the airy mountains, down the rushy glen. We daren't go a-hunting for fear of little men. Do you know that poem? And that was written by William Allingham. Now, he was actually a tax collector. He was from Ireland, but he used to have to come to England fairly regularly to London for business. And he hung out while he was there with the pre-Raphaelites. And he had this girlfriend, a woman called Jeanette, who also worked in the same hat shop as Lizzie Siddal. Now, Jeanette one evening said to him when they were leaving, oh, you know, we're walking home with Lizzie. She lives just near me. Whether she didn't want to be on her own with him, maybe she was fed up with him, who knows? Or maybe she didn't want Lizzie walking home on her own. But he was obviously a bit fed up about this. But then he realized that this was the kind of woman who would make the perfect model for a friend of his. Now, this young man was a pre-Raphaelite, but not part of the Brotherhood. His name was Walter Howell Deverell. And he was a man who was great friends with Rossetti and Millais and Holman Hunt, the people who had set up the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, this new artistic movement in 1848. And through his friendship with Dante Rossetti, he had become obsessed, as Rossetti himself had been, with women with red hair. Now, red hair at this point had been extremely unfashionable. So for any redheads listening today, you should be very grateful to Lizzie Siddal and to the pre-Raphaelites in general for bringing red hair to the forefront of the British imagination and literally changing the face of female beauty in 19th century England. For redheaded men, I'm sorry it took a little bit longer, but for redheaded women, the mid-19th century was a time of suddenly having gone from being really not considered beautiful to being considered the most gorgeous part of the kind of artistic canon. And so he was looking for a red-headed model. And he was also looking for a model who was, as he said, slim enough to believably wear men's clothing, because he was painting a scene from Twelfth Night. And he wanted someone to be Viola, and he wanted to paint her in men's clothes. So William Allingham said to his friend, I've seen this woman who could be a great model for you. Now, Deverell had a plan here, because he knew that if he just walked in as this young kind of reprobate artist and he went into a hat shop and said, hey, I want to paint you, any woman would say, are you mad? Being an artist model at that point was seen as being akin to being a prostitute. It was a bit like being an actress at the time. There was a lot of prejudice about it. Some artist models probably were sex workers because they had no alternative, but most of them were professional artist models who earned a decent living. So what Deverell did was he got his mother, who was very well connected and had a carriage with a crest on the side. He got her to go to the hat shop to really wow Mrs. Tozer. Who knows, perhaps she even bought a hat. And she went in and she approached Lizzie and she said, my son would like to paint you and you will be firmly chaperoned. Either myself or one of my two daughters would be with you at all times in the studio. Now, Lizzie knew that she would need to get her parents' permission for this. So Mrs. Deverell, in her grand carriage, went down to the East End of London. She went to the Old Kent Road and she spoke to Lizzie's mother. Now, it seems that it's probably a very good thing for art history that Mr. Siddal was not at home that day, because he was furious when he found this out. However, Mrs. Siddal said yes, and perhaps one of the reasons that she said yes was partly possibly because she was bowled over by this very glamorous aristocratic woman who came to her front door, but also because she was aware that being a milliner's assistant was really hard work. She wasn't just swanning around modelling hats for the customers. She was spending very, very long hours working at back-breaking work that was bad for your back, your arms, your shoulders, your hands, and your eyes. All of these things that happened with women who worked in the rag trade at that time in very poor working conditions. During the London season, when the aristocratic women wanted their hats as quickly as possible, you could just work 24 hours a day. You'd sleep, you'd stay in wherever you were working in the fashion industry, you'd sleep on the floor when you got a chance, and you'd carry on working until everything was produced for these very demanding customers. So perhaps that's why Mrs. Siddal agreed that Lizzie could do the work. So she went part-time at the hat shop and she started working as a model. And Deverell wrote to his friends, he said, she is amazing. You've got to come and see this woman. She's the best model. And for me, I think that it seems that Lizzie had the kind of painterly version of photogenia. Everybody who painted her wanted her to keep modeling for them. She could stand incredibly still or lie incredibly still. They could just kind of place her into a position and she wouldn't move, probably because half the time she was doped up on laudanum. So she was able to just kind of zone out and be there. But she was an amazing model and she became absolutely brilliant as a professional. This is something that's often not looked at when we consider these artist works of the 19th century. So many men painted women, and the women are just seen as these kind of, pretty playthings. To be an artist model, and some of you may have worked as an artist model today. I can't sit still for long enough. It's a really demanding world and it's a hard job. I have a friend who is a portrait painter today, and he chooses, when he paints figurative works of art, non-portraits, he says he works with ballet dancers because ballet dancers are able, they're so well trained, they are able to hold a position for such a long time. For most people, it's a really physically demanding, grueling job. But Lizzie was really, really good at it. So the next person to paint her was William Holman Hunt. He was part of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. So to just tell you a little bit about them, the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood was a rebellious artistic movement. We tend to think of it today as this very mainstream, rather dull, conventional Victorian art. However, at its own time, it was groundbreaking. It was a secret society. It was extremely rebellious, and its plan was to bring down the art world from the inside. They essentially wanted to take the Royal Academy and shake it up and move it around and do all sorts of crazy things to make the art world change. They were fed up with being preached to about Joshua Reynolds. Okay, Joshua Reynolds was an amazing artist, but he died half a century earlier. And here they were still being told that they had to listen to everything that Sir Joshua had said when he was president of the Royal Academy. So it was founded by three young men: John Everett Millais, Dante Gabriel Rossetti, and William Holman Hunt. Now, these three young men had their first meeting in 1848, and then they recruited 4 other members, young men who were also studying at the Royal Academy. And they were included, of course, William Michael Rossetti, Dante's younger brother. So the other 3 members were James Collinson, who I think is the Pre-Raphaelite brother who everybody always forgets, Thomas Woolner, who was the sculptor of the group, and Fred Stevens, better known as F.G. Stevens, who became most famous as an art critic. The 3 who became the most famous and whose work is in art galleries and sells best today are the 3 founder members. Now, William Holman Hunt was determined to paint Lizzie, and he instantly, without even having seen her, just from Allingham telling him about her, wrote to her and begged him to sit to him, and then he told the others about her. And Dante met Lizzie in the winter of 1849 to 1850. This was at the height of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, which was a short-lived movement, the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. It had completely come to an end within 5 years in 1853, when Thomas Woolner left for Australia to try his hand in the gold rush, because art was extremely difficult. He and the 3 founders went on to become very well-respected artists, but this was at a time when it was extremely difficult. Dante Rossetti, for example, owed money to every single art supply shop in London, so it was said. He constantly had to borrow money off friends or to borrow materials off friends because he couldn't afford to pay his debts. But when he met Lizzie, he knew that this was the woman who was going to be his muse. Now, he started painting her. Initially, she was still sitting to other people, and the most famous painting that she sat to was for John Everett Millais as Ophelia, which is the one that's on the cover of this book, and you can see her here. She was the most extraordinary model, and you can see the different versions of my book. There is actually another version that's just another hardback, a smaller format hardback, which is currently being reprinted to go with the Tate Britain Rossetti's exhibition, because they sold out of the paperback and they're reissuing a smaller format hardback, which I'm very excited about. But Lizzie was she was the model who modeled for Ophelia, and that was how most people knew her at the time and how most people recognize her today. And the story behind this is that Millais painted the surroundings, all of the nature, during one summer when he and William Holman Hunt rented a farmhouse or rented a building from a farm in Surrey, and they painted by the River Ewell in Surrey. And then in the winter, he hired Lizzie to lie in a bathtub of water wearing an antique dress, and he placed flowers all around her. And he actually had to paint, couldn't have all of them in season at the time, so he had to paint them when they were in bloom and add them in. But he created this image of Ophelia drowning in the water, in the river. Now, it's the most extraordinary painting because it's so lifelike, and there have been discussions for so many years over whether has she actually died? Is it the moment that she's breathing her last? Lizzie was such a good model that while she was lying there, the system that he and his mother, Millais' mother, was amazingly involved in his artwork. They had devised this system to keep the water warm, which was a series of lamps underneath the bath. This was in December in London. Now, I've been into the room in which Millais painted that. It's now a prosaic kind of teaching room for University College Hospital in London, in Bloomsbury. But at the time, it was the Millais family home. I recorded a radio interview there in one September. and it was cold. So imagine in a pre-centrally heated world, lying in a bathtub of water in December and the lamps went out. Now, Lizzie was such a perfect model. She just lay there and suffered for Millet's art. That was why they adored her. You will read many times on the internet that Lizzie died posing for this painting. People want her to have died posing for it. It would make this great tragic story even more tragic. She didn't. She did get a very bad cold and a chill, and her father, who, as we know, was quite litigious, threatened to sue Millet because of the costs of being ill were really exorbitant. This was pre-NHS, of course. It could really set back a family's finances, anybody needing medication or doctor's treatment. And Millet absolutely paid all the bills and settled out of court, as he would have done. He went on to become, well, this was the painting really that saved his career, and he went on to become incredibly famous after that. My own family played a part in Millet's initial downfall, which is when my great-great-great-grandfather Charles Dickens wrote a very cross article about a slightly earlier painting of Millet's, Christ in the House of His Parents, also known as Christ in the Carpenter's Shop, which is on display at the Tate Britain. Now, Dickens wrote a very angry article about Pre-Raphaelites in general, and this was when the secret of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood had been exposed. So they were at a party, as I said earlier, they were a secret society. You may have seen on TV a few years ago a program called Desperate Romantics. It was a really fun kind of drama based around the Pre-Raphaelites, and Lizzie Siddal was one of the major characters in it. But it definitely wasn't historically accurate. There were only 3 members of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, and they walked around the Royal Academy shouting, "We're the Brotherhood, we're the Brotherhood." It didn't happen like that. They were very much a secret society based on the kind of Illuminati, the Carbonari, the secret Italian societies that Dante Rossetti's father had told him about. And at a party that they had, one of their friends, a sculptor called Alexander Monroe, got a bit drunk and spoke to a new acquaintance of his and said, "Have you heard about this society my friends have got? They're going to change the Royal Academy. They're going to do this, they're going to do that." And this new acquaintance happened to be a journalist. This was a great scoop for him, and he broke the story of what the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood was doing. Now, until this time, people at the Royal Academy had not known what these mysterious letters PRB that were being put after the names of these young artists. PRA meant President of the Royal Academy, but what was PRB? Suddenly, it started to be talked about, and that was just when the summer exhibition had opened. So Charles Dickens wrote a very cross, very funny article in his magazine, Household Words, about the Pre-Raphaelites. And this really caused a huge problem. Many years later, in 1903, long after Dickens's death, his daughter Katie wrote an article called "My Father as a Lover of Art and Artists." And she said that her father had felt really bad about the repercussions that this article had had for the Pre-Raphaelite world, and how many artists, including, ironically, Dickens's own future son-in-law, a man called Charles Alston Collins, really struggled because of Dickens's article when people turned against the Pre-Raphaelites, and Millet's painting had been singled out. This painting of Ophelia was the one that gave Millet his reputation back. He'd always had a very good reputation until then. He was a child prodigy. He entered the Royal Academy at the age of 11. He was astonishingly well known, but this article by Dickens had really set him back. Ophelia, starring Lizzie Siddal, was the one that set him on his way to stardom. And Millet then became one of the most important painters in the 19th century. He was the most highly paid portrait painter in Britain in the 1870s, when he turned from genre painting and scenes to portraits. He was one of Queen Victoria's favourite artists, and at the very end of his life, he would become the president of the Royal Academy, the foundation that he had sought, of course, to change from the inside. And actually, of course, they managed to do so. From this, Lizzie could never pretend that she hadn't been a model, and this was something that could cause her problems in later life. She, however, decided that she was going to make the most of it, and she was soon taken on as a kind of project, really, by John Ruskin, the great art historian who had been the person, when Dickens wrote so angrily about the Pre-Raphaelites, he had been the person who'd stepped into the fray and described them as the best thing to happen to British art in several hundred years. Now, John Ruskin saw in Lizzie's work, which people look at today and say, oh, it's really naive, she's not as good as the men. Well, Lizzie didn't start learning art until she was in her 20s, until she was with Dante Rossetti. So yes, her surviving paintings may look very naive, but when you consider that they had been having art lessons since childhood, the way she took great strides forward was astonishing. Within a couple of years, she was working in oils, and John Ruskin could see in her that she had a really great talent. And I think that, for someone like Ruskin to realize that, he really did see what other people couldn't. And he was ahead of his time in the way he looked at many works of art. When you look at work of the later 19th century, after Lizzie died, she died very young, the French Impressionists and the Expressionists, you can see that Lizzie's work, had she gone on to develop it, could really have become as important as those later artists. However, as is the fate of almost all female artists, she's been forgotten in the sands of time and remembered mostly for her work as a model to male artists. Soon after Ophelia, however, Dante Rossetti asked Lizzie only to sit to him, possibly another reason why Ruskin wanted her to develop her own career. He was working with Rossetti, and he was working with people who wanted to buy pre-Raphaelite art, and he knew that he needed Rossetti to concentrate on his own work. He went round famously to Rossetti's studio one day. There was a commission that Rossetti had been asked to do, and it was through Ruskin. Ruskin had brokered the deal, and Rossetti hadn't produced it. And Rossetti's servant let him into the studio to find this painting. And Ruskin allegedly opened drawer after drawer, and there were literally hundreds, if not thousands, of drawings, sketches, and paintings of Lizzie Siddal, but not the commission that he was meant to have been working on. This obsession that Rossetti had for Lizzie was something like the kind of Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton romance in the 20th century. They had this very on-off relationship. Rossetti was not faithful to her, and she would then end it with him. And when I started writing this biography, I had this opinion that Rossetti was an absolute cad and that Lizzie had been this poor victim. And I soon came to realize that wasn't the case, that actually they were both incredibly difficult to live with. And of course, something I hadn't taken into account was that Rossetti was in love with an addict. And for Lizzie, her drug addiction was a defining part of her life. It's not something that people tend to associate with the 19th century. People like to believe that their generation invented drugs and sex, but that absolutely wasn't the case. You look back at the Romantic artists, who the Pre-Raphaelites were hugely influenced by, and you realize that drug culture had always been a big part of it, as had partner swapping and all sorts of love affairs outside of marriage. We tend to think the Victorians were very straight-laced and conventional. That's because they had to be, because the laws expected them to be. But as with any restrictive society, you just look under the radar, underneath that veneer, and you will find that there were people living as they always have done. So Lizzie and Dante became unofficially engaged in around 1851. They were believed by their friends to be engaged, and they were seen as a couple. But it was also known that Rossetti had love affairs with other women. And so regularly they would break up, and there would be this kind of big row, and they would stop speaking to each other, but they would always get back together. However, eventually Lizzie got fed up with him. They had been essentially living together. Dante and his younger brother, William, took on the rent of a flat in Blackfriars. It was a one-bedroom flat. William never seems to have got the chance to live there. Dante lived there, and Lizzie lived on the other side of Blackfriars Bridge with her parents, but it's known that she stayed there regularly. If she wasn't sleeping with him, then she lost her reputation needlessly, because everybody in the building believed that she was. I think it's people still maintain that they had a platonic relationship until they got married. It's a very strange understanding of human nature, I believe. One thing I discovered was that in 1854, when Lizzie had one of her mysterious illnesses, which were a regular feature of her life, and Dante Rossetti fell out with his family when he rushed from his father's grave, not staying for the full funeral, to go down to Hastings because Lizzie had written that she needed him. One thing I discovered was that Hastings was known, and I discovered this, by the way, at the Hastings Local Studies Library. If you're researching anything, local studies libraries are your friends. They are amazing resources, hugely underfunded and much needed. So campaign for them in your local community, because I discovered that Hastings was a place where not only people went to recuperate from illnesses, but it was where women would go if they wanted to get rid of an unwanted baby. I'm not talking backstreet abortions. I'm talking being given vigorous exercise regimes. So here was the woman who was so ill, she had to leave London and go down to Hastings, which was well known as a place for invalids. And yet Dante Rossetti writes of them taking 10-mile hikes across the downs. One of the things, and it's not recorded that she did this, but one of the ways in which a miscarriage could be encouraged was requesting that women went riding and sitting not side saddle as they would have expected to ride a horse at that time, but to ride a horse like a man rode a horse. And this was a common way to bring on a miscarriage. Perhaps Lizzie had a pregnancy at that time that they wanted to get rid of, who knows? But for whatever reason, Dante rushed away from his family and went down to Hastings to be with her. Interestingly, although the Rossetti family did not like Lizzie, Christina Rossetti, who many of you may have heard of, in fact, she was my first introduction to the Pre-Raphaelites. I fell in love with Christina Rossetti's poetry when I was a teenager, and through her discovered her brother's work and then Lizzie Siddal herself. Christina Rossetti wrote a poem that I find very interesting. And I'm going to read this to you because she froze Lizzie out. When Lizzie had to go to the Rossetti's house, she felt that Christina and all of the others were very unfriendly to her. Yet she wrote this poem called In an Artist's Studio. And this is included in the current Tate exhibition, and I'm very glad they put it in. One face looks out from all his canvases. One self-same figure sits or walks or leans. We found her hidden just behind those screens. That mirror gave back all her loveliness. A queen in opal or in ruby dress, a nameless girl in freshest summer greens, a saint, an angel. Every canvas means the same one meaning, neither more nor less. He feeds upon her face by day and night, and she with true kind eyes looks back on him. Fair as the moon and joyful as the light, not one with waiting, not with sorrow dim, not as she is, but was when hope shone bright, not as she is, but as she fills his dream. That to me is an incredible poem from a woman who really didn't like Lizzie, that she's also got this amazing empathy for the fact that he's painting her in his own vision. It's the true meaning of the male gaze. And she can also see that Lizzie has grown one with waiting. Nobody understood why Rossetti didn't marry her. In 1856, Ford Madox Brown, their friend, the artist, wrote in his diary, "Why does he not marry her?" And it was around that time that Lizzie finally left him. She disappeared. He didn't know where she was. We know that she went up to Sheffield, where her father was from. She stayed with some relations, and they were very well connected, a very prominent local family with a good amount of money. And while she was living with them, she went to art college. She wanted to find out if she could truly be an artist, whether they'd just been flattering her because she was Rossetti's girlfriend, or whether she really had talent. Her art teacher, a man called Mr. Young Mitchell, fell in love with her. It was unrequited, but we know that Lizzie really did some fascinating things while she was there. One of the things is that thanks to Ruskin, she had been sent off to Paris a couple of years earlier. Well, she'd been sent off to the south of France to recuperate. He actually specified no more than 24 hours in Paris to recover from her journey. However, she and her chaperone decided to stay in Paris, and Lizzie bought all the latest fashions. Well, when she was in Sheffield, she was teased by the other students because she never wore a corset. She wore very bohemian clothes, the kind of things that in the 1960s became fashionable as pre-Raphaelite hippie dressing. They all teased her and they were mean to her. And then they were going to an exhibition in Manchester, and Ophelia was on display. And Lizzie appeared at the station in Sheffield, dressed in her Paris finery. Okay, it was a year out of date, but it would be many years before that kind of fashion was going to make it to Sheffield. So she was at the absolute cutting edge of fashion, wearing a corset, wearing her hair up, looking as grand as possible. Apparently the teasing stopped, not least because they got to Manchester and there was Ophelia and Lizzie as the model, and everybody crowded around her. Now, during that time, there's about 18 months after she's gone to Sheffield that I couldn't find anything about, I and other researchers, this 18 months mysterious time in Lizzie's life, and I have really tried. However, I do love that she kept that air of mystery. Now, Rossetti couldn't find her either, and she completely disappeared. In 1859, her father died, and I assume that she must have come back to help care for him. And then her family got in touch with Ruskin. Lizzie was dying. She was in Hastings and she was dying. And Rossetti was told by Ruskin, they said, "We think Rossetti needs to know." And he raced to Hastings. And crucially, he had with him, after 10 years of engagement, a marriage license. When he got there, Lizzie was too ill to go to the church. She was very, very ill at the time. We don't know what this mysterious illness was. She would repeatedly have these mysterious illnesses, but probably due to her addiction. It took several weeks, and then eventually she was well enough to walk 5 minutes down the road to the church, and they were finally married. They went on an extended honeymoon to France. They lived in Paris for 6 months, and they had a wonderful time together. They seemed very, very happy. They came home from their honeymoon with 2 dogs, and Lizzie was pregnant. It was all wonderful. William Morris had recently married Jane Morris, Lizzie's great rival. She knew that Dante, her husband, had a huge crush on Jane, and they were also having their first child. Sadly, Lizzie miscarried. Well, Lizzie gave birth to a stillborn baby. She didn't actually miscarry it, but at 7 months, she felt it stopped moving. And she had no choice at that time. There were, of course, no scans, no good medicine. She just had to wait until she gave birth to a dead daughter. This was something that she never, ever got over. And in the 19th century, you were just expected to get over that. Of course, she couldn't. And when Rossetti had work he had to do, he had to go up to Leeds. He sent her to stay with their great friends, William and Jane Morris. Not only was Lizzie always paranoid about her husband's feelings about Jane Morris, but they had a young baby and Janie was pregnant again. Can you imagine the torture that was for Lizzie? And then she disappeared. They didn't know where she was. She had left their home in Kent and she had walked back to London. And that she was found in their flat on her own with no money and no food, and Rossetti was sending friends round desperately. In 1862, Lizzie Siddal, who by this point, had been expected to have got over the death of her baby, on the night of the 10th of February, 1862, they went out for dinner with their great friend, the poet Swinburne. And he looked very like Lizzie in that he had very similar bright red hair. And Dante Rossetti used to describe them as like brother and sister. He said they played together, they romped like puppies. He never had any paranoia about Swinburne. He was very, very jealous of all other men around Lizzie, but not Swinburne. They just got on incredibly well. And they went out for dinner with Swinburne. Swinburne said that Lizzie seemed kind of more excitable than usual, but he knew that she was addicted to laudanum. And then they went home, and Swinburne left them, and Dante Rossetti had to go out for the evening. He was teaching at the Working Men's College, a charity that was the founding of which was helped by Ruskin. Ruskin used to provide lots of artists to go and teach men. It was kind of evening class for men who hadn't been able to get an education elsewhere. When Rossetti left, there was half a bottle of laudanum next to the bed, and Lizzie was going to bed early. And when he came back, the bottle was empty. Now, it was disputed for many years, but it definitely seems to have happened that Lizzie had a note pinned to her nightgown in which she asked her husband to take care of her younger brother, the one who was disabled. And we know that the Rossetti family continued to take care of him to the end of his life. They took care of him financially. When Rossetti got back and he found this note, he called doctors. He called 4 doctors. He'd taken the note away so the doctors wouldn't see it because suicide was illegal and it was a huge stigma. It would have been a huge stigma for Lizzie's family and for his family. He went round to his great friend, Ford Madox Brown, who came back with him. And they decided that they would burn the note. We only know about this note because he later told his daughter, who told her family, and it later came out many, many years later. After Rossetti's death, after Lizzie's death, Rossetti continued to paint her. And you can see in this picture here, this is the American copy of my book. It's called Lizzie Siddal, Face of the Pre-Raphaelites. Don't be tempted to buy it and think it's a different book. I've had people write to me saying, I thought you'd written a second book. I'm sorry about that if you did. They always change the title in America. And this is Beata Beatrix. Now, there are 3 different versions of this. There's one in the Tate Britain in London, there's one in the Art Institute in Chicago, and there's one in a private collection. They're all slightly different, subtly different. But in each one, a bird, a dove, is bringing a poppy to Beatrix, or Beatrice, who was the unrequited love of Dante Alighieri, the medieval Florentine poet after whom Dante Rossetti was named, and indeed whose work he had translated into English. His father was a Dante scholar. And in this, we can see Lizzie Siddal very definitely identified with with Dante Alighieri's lover. It's the moment when her soul is going up to heaven. It's attaining ecstasy. But many people who've looked at this, and perhaps many people who knew Lizzie Siddal, would have recognized that look on her face as that of an addict who had just had their fix. And this was something that Dante was all too well acquainted with, the fact that Lizzie needed her laudanum, and that is what the dove is bringing to Beatrice, the opium poppy that creates laudanum. This was painted after Lizzie's death. She died in 1862, and Dante started painting this in 1864 and continued it until 1870. Rossetti also became obsessed with the idea that Lizzie was trying to contact him. He had seances. There was a bird that would come and sing outside his window every morning, and he was convinced that it was Lizzie calling to him. She was buried at Highgate Cemetery, sadly, in the Rossetti family grave. They didn't approve of her in life, but she was buried with them. 7 years after her death, he was persuaded by his agent, a man called Charles Augustus Howell, who deserves his own biography. He was extraordinary. He persuaded Rossetti to publish his poems, knowing that Rossetti's poems had been buried in Lizzie's coffin. And so poor old Lizzie was exhumed at Highgate Cemetery in the dead of night, in great secrecy. Actually, Rossetti was not the owner of the grave. It was his mother, who would never have agreed for her husband's grave, as it was as well, to have been opened. Rossetti, however, was a big name by 1869, and the Home Office agreed to this in great secrecy. The grave was opened and the poems were retrieved. Now, Dante Rossetti was not able to go. He was struggling hugely with his mental health at this time. In fact, a couple of years later, he would himself attempt suicide unsuccessfully. He was really, really struggling with his mental health at the time. So the agent, Charles Augustus Howell, went. He left Rossetti with his own wife, Kitty, to take care of him. And he was the most extraordinary liar, Howell. His stories were phenomenal. He should have been writing fiction. And he came back and he said to Rossetti that Lizzie had not deteriorated. She was not a skeleton. And I did check. Laudanum has no preservative properties, and she definitely was not embalmed. This was great fabrication, but he said she was as beautiful in death as she had been in life, that her hair had grown and filled the whole coffin. They had opened the coffin by bonfire light because they had to do it in the middle of the night in secrecy, and he said that her hair burnished copper in the flames. You will read this on internet sites all over the world. There has become a cult around Lizzie Siddal, the cult of Ophelia, this dead woman who has become so well known. At Highgate Cemetery, I was told that around Halloween, they always become very nervous and they always have to have guards, making sure that nobody tries to get in to Lizzie Siddal's grave. She does not walk. She is not undead. She is buried. However, there are these phenomenal stories that grow up around her. She's a quite extraordinary cult figure. Lizzie Siddal, to me, has always been somebody who I've been fascinated with since teenage years, and I absolutely loved writing her biography. She was a poet. She was a very well-respected poet in her own time. I mean, not as well known as her sister-in-law Christina, but her poetry is good. I've got some of it published in this book, and she's somebody who deserves to be better known. So I was absolutely thrilled when I saw that the Tate, when they put on this exhibition, that a third of, I'd say that's not a scientific analysis, but I'd say, having gone around it, roughly a third of the works in that exhibition are either by Lizzie or of Lizzie and inspired by her. So I'm going to look at your comments now. What was her position within the siblings? She was the third in the family. And a perfect scene to restage at Sheffield Station. Thank you for that comment. I think we should do that. Let's all do that. Let's do like a Goldster flash mob and go up and recreate this at Sheffield Station. Remember by Christina Rossetti was included in my mother's funeral. Yeah, that's a wonderful poem, and it's such a gorgeous part of Victorian poetry. Some of it's quite mawkish, but I think that one's really beautiful. I hope I've given you a chance to understand a little bit more about Lizzie. I'm very happy to answer any questions if you have them. And I'm very glad, actually, that author cancelled today, because it gave me the chance to talk about one of my own books and my own passions. Lizzie is somebody who I think a lot of us go through phases with, a little bit like Sylvia Plath. For me, it was Christina Rossetti, Lizzie Siddal, and Sylvia Plath. Many teenage girls go through these phases. Oh, and Marilyn Monroe as well. She was my other one. And they are all women who inspire younger generations of women. And I hope that I've given you a little bit of an understanding about her. Thank you for your lovely messages. It's great to hear from so many of you. So thank you for that. If anybody wants to know what's coming up on Goldster, I ought to really tell you now what is coming up next on the book club. So I'm just going to go back to my computer again. So we've got Humphrey is with you next week. So he is going to be talking to Vordy in England, and she is a Chinese author talking about Fortune's Bazaar, the making of Hong Kong. And then we've got our book of the month, which is The Unlikely Pilgrimage of Harold Fry by the brilliant Rachel Joyce, who is a superb writer. It's to tie in with the film that's out at the moment. And then on the 30th of May, we have a very, very special evening event. I'm really excited about this. I am going to be interviewing Louise Minchin. Now, many of you will know Louise Minchin from her many years on the BBC Breakfast couch. She left BBC Breakfast as a brilliant TV presenter, but she left to become a triathlete, and she's actually represented Team GB, which is astonishing. She wrote it for her first book was Dare to Try, spelled T-R-I, about becoming a triathlete, and her new one is called Fearless. In this book, she has met all sorts of incredible women all over the world. And I'm thrilled that Louise Minchin is coming onto Goldster on the 30th of May in a special evening author-to-author session. It starts at 6:30 p.m. that night. And she's going to be talking about all of the incredible women that she met. And then just to give you a quick insight into what's coming up in June. On the 1st of June, I shall be interviewing Shravani Basu, who's a wonderful author. We're talking about her book, Victoria and Abdul, which is the book that the film was made about Queen Victoria and Abdul Karim. Shravani was one of our early Goldster authors. She came on to talk about her brilliant book, The Mystery of the Parsi Lawyer, the true story about Arthur Conan Doyle and George Adelgee, a miscarriage of justice that Arthur Conan Doyle managed to, he turned into Sherlock Holmes for a while and managed to reverse this miscarriage of justice. And then on the 2nd of June, I'm going to be interviewing a face that's very familiar to you. I'm going to be interviewing a certain author called Humphrey Hawksley about his book, Man on Ice. And this is thank you to several people who have requested that I interview Humphrey. I'm absolutely thrilled. So thank you for those of you who've suggested it. I took that on board and I will be interviewing him on the 2nd of June. And we've got a comment here about Elizabeth McNeil's book, The Doll Factory. Yes, she was hugely influenced by Lizzie Siddal. She did base it on her. Thank you very much for that. In fact, I want to ask Elizabeth to come onto Goldster to talk about her books. And she's very much influenced by my Lizzie Siddal biography, which is really exciting. And some of you may remember when Armistead Maupin came on early in Goldster. Armistead Maupin, the fantastic American author of Tales of the City. He is writing a sequel to his Tales of the City at the moment, and I was so thrilled when he revealed on Goldster that one of his characters has an obsession with Lizzie Siddal and that he was inspired by my biography. That was just one of my most amazing moments as an author. So thank you very much, everybody. Have a great weekend. And I will look forward to seeing you all next week for Book of the Month. But before that, you've got Humphrey next Tuesday. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.